Hello, everyone. I'm Adeola Adewale Olajubabe, and we are still on the sustainable banking principles. And now we are going to be focusing on the sectoral guidelines in sustainable banking. In the previous presentation, we did talked about how sustainable banking is considered as the delivery of financial products and services, which are developed to meet the needs of people and safeguard the environment while generating profits. And we talked about the 9 sustainable banking principles. The 9 sustainable banking principles. So right now we are going to be taking a look into the sectoral guidelines in sustainable banking. The first sector we are going to take a look at is the power sector. The nature and type of environmental and social risk that could be associated with financing power generation would depend greatly on the scale and type of activity that is being considered. And then we have the different types of power generation. We have the oil-fired power units, which emit a comparable level of pollutants, that's air emissions, as a coal-fired power. However, most technologies that burn oil are also capable of using natural gas, with the exception of diesel-fired generators though. Therefore, the natural gas and oil-fired capacity are roughly interchangeable. And then the climate change concerns and demands from stakeholders for a cleaner fuel have encouraged the switch from oil to natural gas. So because it is believed that the use of oil attracts more environmental issues. So now we go to natural gas, which has become an increasingly popular fuel as a result of its thermal efficiency, relative cost efficiency in transport, and even environmental performance. The natural gas-fired plants emit lower particulate matters. That's lower particulate gases. Excuse me, that's the SOx and the NOx emission, which are, about 60% of those from plants using coal. That's when you compare. And also they have lower CO2 emissions per unit of energy produced. Though the natural gas is accurately viewed as a relatively cleaner fuel than other fossil fuel, based on sources such as coal, nonetheless, it can generate environmental and social concerns. For example, there is a growing reluctance among local communities to allow siting of gas-related infrastructure, includes proximity to populations due to some health and safety reasons. And then we also have the transportation of gas in pipelines or liquefied form, which also pose safety and security challenges. We have challenges such as the risk of explosion, pipeline vandalism, attacks at the LNG tankers or the gasification plant, and on like that. So that takes us to another type of power generation, which is hydropower. And as increasing scrutiny is brought to the greenhouse gas emission profile of power generation technologies, hydropower projects appear comparatively attractive. Although the hydropower is not without significant ESMS risk as well, but consideration needs to be given to some that has lesser risk. And then when we take a look at this hydropower, we need to consider some risks such as the inundation of critical natural habitat and protected areas like people and economic displacement. Sometimes we have loss of assets such as land, crops, fisheries, including the upstream or downstream from the reservoir, the agricultural land are lost, and even how the water flow or quality may be affected as well. It may be affected, especially with projects that affect international waterways and where dams will significantly affect the water supply or quality of downstream ecosystem or community. So all this needs to be considered as the ESMS issues for the hydropower. Now, that will take us to the biofuel and the rapid rise in the biofuel investment, particularly ethanol as a sustainable fuel source, is a defining feature of the sustainable energy debate. Biofuel have a number of significant ESMS impacts associated with the scale-up of biofuel production, and they include conversion of natural habitats and a range of social impact as a result of the large-scale production of biofuel. In addition, certain biofuel are also subject to criticism in some cases where biofuel crops are competing with the production of food crops. And that will take us to the final one we are going to look at as a type of power generation in the power sector, which is the solar and wind technology. There has been an increased use of this source as power generation. For instance, we have the large-scale concentrated photovoltaic operations. We have the onshore and even offshore wind farms. And this wind and the solar technology are relatively low risk in terms of ESMS impact. However, we should also consider some significant land use that are required for a large-scale wind and solar power generation activity. And then this can have measurable impact if there are sensitivities, environmentally sensitive areas around, the locations where it is to be sited. And then we could have land ownership issues, maybe habitat destruction, defragmentation, and, so many other things. In addition, the ESMS impact may be identified like the natural resource use, the impact caused by associated facilities, that is for electricity transmission, because there are some associated facilities that are together with this technology. Also, we have potential social issues with land and economic displacement, and even sometimes resettlement. That is why all this sector is being brought under the That's why it is being brought under the sustainable banking principle, and there are guidelines that cover it. And this guideline covers the provision of financial products and services for the power sector, which include the power generation sources and associated facilities. That is, the source of the power generation should be looked into. And then also in terms of electricity, for instance, now the electricity distribution and transmission infrastructure, and then the alternative source of power generation and associated facility should be considered as well. And then these guidelines applies to all corporate lending projects and structured finance that exist in the power sector. It covers for all of them that exist in the power sector. And then there are certain objectives that these guidelines are to meet. The first, we have the assisting of the bank in the identification and management of the ESMS risk associated with provision of financial product. That is, depending on the source of power generation, the bank, the guideline will help the bank in identification of the risk, and then also provide additional sector-specific guideline to supplement the Nigerian banking principle guideline, and finally to ensure that bank adopts relevant international standard and best practices in the practice of in the management of their ESMS risk exposure. Now, Nigeria's total installed energy generation capacity is currently derived from oil and gas, which takes 77%, and hydropower, which takes 23%. First, the large dependence on oil and gas for energy production, which is traditionally associated with significant negative ESMS impacts to the environment and society, also creates vulnerability for Nigeria with respect to potential climate change impacts. In addition, the country has poor electricity transmission infrastructure that makes distributing energy supply difficult. The NPC therefore recognizes the challenges associated with power generation, transmission, and distribution, and noted this in the National Transformation Agenda under the Vision 2020 for Nigeria, which aims at transforming the nation's economic landscape. Number two, the National Technical Working Group on the Energy Sector reported in the Vision 2020 document that energy is critical to economic development. Therefore, we have various types of power generation, that are associated with a diverse range of E&S impacts. That is why the power sector needs to ensure that there is a sustainability in their operation, and there is increasing attention to the E&S risk profile of power generation technologies, notably with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. So it is very important, which is why it has been brought under this guidance notes. And there are certain requirements, there are certain banking requirements that should be fulfilled by the power sector before it can be financed. First, we have the undertaking of the appropriate E&S due diligence on power sector clients and activities, and to identify and assess the potential E&S risk, and also determine the client's ability to effectively manage those identified risks. Very important. Very, very important. Now, for new power development, a bank will require a client to provide a detailed E&S impact assessment, and for existing development, require a recent environmental and social audit. Another requirement is that the bank requires power sector clients to comply with the international and the national laws governing the environmental and social issues. Also, it encourages power sector clients to meet the requirements of IFC's performance standards and the relevant environmental health and safety guidelines that represent the minimum international acceptable good practice. It also refers to the key sustainability initiatives, and where relevant, banks will request that clients will work towards enhanced performance consistent with such initiative standards and good practice. And of course, promote and encourage the uptake of opportunities relating to clean technology, renewable energy, as appropriate. We have two main risk categorization for the power sector. We have the high risk transaction, which involves activities that carry potential significant adverse E&S risk or impact that are diverse, irreversible, or unprecedented. Examples of these types of power transaction that will fall into this category will include the large thermal power stations and other combustion installation, or hydro scheme involving large or medium scale dams, or even hydropower schemes on international waterways, or small hydropower schemes on rivers or water bodies that are already significantly altered by other abstraction or power generation activities. We can even have associated facilities such as pipelines, terminals, and associated facilities for we have transmission lines and all of those things, which are categorized under the high risk transaction. The medium risk transaction, on the other hand, involves activities which carry potential limited adverse E&S risk or impacts that are few in number. They are generally site-specific, and they are largely reversible and readily addressed through mitigation measures. And examples include maybe small combustion facilities of about 3 to 20. We have maybe like a 10 or 50 megawatts run of hydro power plants without additional up or downstream power projects, medium or small scale wind and solar power projects, and even some types of biomass that does not involve hazardous materials. We have quite a number of regulations that draw attention to relevant issues. The list is not exhaustive, we just have a few of them. We have a few of them listed there. We have the IFC performance standards, we have the IFC EHS guidelines of 2006, we have the electricity reform, and we have so many regulations. The list is not exhaustive. So we move to the agricultural sector guideline. This guideline has been designed to complement the Nigerian's sustainable banking principle while focusing on the agricultural sector. And the objectives range from assisting the bank in identifying and management of complex E&S risks that are associated with financing products and services in the agri sector, providing sector-specific guidance, ensure that bank adopt relevant standards, regulations, and then strategically position agri as an attractive, rewarding, and sustainable business opportunity. Given the large proportion of the population that depends on agriculture as a source of livelihood, it is clear that agriculture is a practical means of reducing poverty, unemployment, food insecurity, while providing raw materials for industries and exports in the medium to long term. Research even suggests that if the agricultural growth targets set by the federal government are met, the country will have 9.5% annual growth in the sector and 8% GDP growth in the next 10 years. So the Nigerian's agricultural sector, which by 2020 contributed about 42% of GDP and employed about 60% of working population, is severely underfunded, and underinvested, with only 2% of all formal credits flowing to the sector. Agricultural lending accounts for approximately 1.4% of formal lending and has been on the decline since 2006. The situation is partly explained by the fact that banks typically perceive agriculture as a high-risk investment due to their limited understanding and lack of confidence in the sector. However, in response to this challenge, the CBN and the Bankers Committee, as well as the Federal Ministry of Environment and Rural Development, have recently developed an agency which ultimately seek to create incentives and encourage the growth of formal credit to the entire agricultural value chain. And then the banking requirements for agri sector financing range from conducting the E&S risk and assessment to adhering to the regulations. And also, we have so many of them that are listed in the guidance note. Encourage and finance processors that add value to local products, endeavor to lend farmers whose products have off-takers and whose farming practices protect the environment. For instance, minimize the use of harmful chemicals, pesticides, efficient use of water resources, adoption of conservation farming technologies, and so on and so forth. The risk categorization in the agri sector is also divided into two. The high-risk transaction, where activities carry potential significant adverse E&S risk that are diverse, irreversible, and unprecedented. And then we have the medium risk transaction, the one with limited adverse risk that are few in number, and then they are reversible, they can be addressed through mitigation measures. And then we also have a number of laws and regulations for the agri sector. The list is not exhaustive. We have so many of them. Now, finally, we go to the oil and gas sector. This sector has been designed to complement the Nigerian banking principle also, even while we are focusing on the oil and gas sector. And there are quite a number of objectives that these guidelines need to satisfy. We have the assisting of bank in identifying and management of complex E&S risk associated with this oil and gas sector, then providing additional sector-specific guidance, and then ensuring that bank adopts relevant international standard and then best practice. The guideline covers the provision of financial products and services for the oil and gas sector, which include but not limited to the exploration, extraction, production, processing, and transport of Nigerian oil and gas. Also, it covers upstream, downstream, and servicing activities. The upstream activities include exploration activities, that's the area and seismic operations, appraisal, drilling, development, and production, including processing and initial storage, transportation, decommissioning and rehabilitation. For the downstream, we have the product refining, transportation, and distribution activities, either via pipeline, roads, or sea vessels. Marketing, including product importation and storage. And for the servicing, we have a provision of technical support services for the upstream and downstream segments in the areas of drilling, well completion, well simulation, logistics, equipment supplies, etc. And then this guideline applies to, just like the other sectors, it applies to all corporate lending projects, structured finance, and in the oil and gas sector. It applies to all of them. And then there are a number of issues. The Nigeria's total energy generation capacity is currently derived from oil and gas, 77%, and hydropower, 23%. And then the large dependency on oil and gas for energy production, which is traditionally associated with significant negative ESMS impacts to the environment and society, also creates vulnerability to Nigeria with respect to potential climate change impacts. And then, in addition, the country has poor electricity transmission, and the NPC recognizes the challenge associated with this power generation, and most especially in the aspect of distribution, transmission, and all of that. So there are so many issues. There are so many issues, from the green gas emissions, as the climate change impacts, the transmission, distributions, the environmental and ecosystem damage. For all activities that fall within the scope of this guideline, a bank shall, for all activities that fall within the scope of this guideline, a bank shall undertake appropriate E&S due diligence on oil and gas sector, as well as determine the client's ability to effectively manage the identified risk. Then the bank shall require the oil and gas sector client to comply with the regulations, the laws governing the E&S issues, and also encourage the client to meet the requirements of the IFC standards and the other international standards. And then the bank shall refer to key sustainability initiatives and request that the clients work towards enhanced performance consistent with initiative standards and good practice, such as the human rights, the biodiversity, transparency, gas flaring, emergency response, marine pollution, and so on and so forth. We have quite a number of regulations as well. We have a lot of related laws that are, in line with the oil and gas sector, which would be considered for any project in the oil and gas sector. Similarly, the risk categorization is high and medium. The high involves activities that have potential risks that are irreversible and unprecedented, while the medium involves activities with potential adverse risk that are reversible and can be addressed through mitigation. And we have some examples of major issues that may affect the categorization of the oil and gas transaction. We have issues like the locations. We have maybe some that are located near natural habitat or protected areas. We have some maybe because issues of those locations in remote areas. maybe issues of those that rely on gas flaring as a management strategy for associated gases, which is considered as a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. We have issues such as the indigenous or traditional communities, social conflict. So many issues can actually affect the categorization of the oil and gas sector. Most importantly, a bank should engage with all the sectors and encourage good environmental and social risk management practices. And also, where clients did not meet certain standards due to some factors, should, where appropriate, ensure that these E&S risks are monitored and the ongoing compliance is addressed. If they did not meet the requirements, they should follow up with them, monitor their activity, and ensure that the compliance issue is addressed. And then most importantly, all the sectors need to report, they need to give reports that will demonstrate their compliance and commitment to all the sustainable banking principles, and also indicates the progress they are making. And the report would, as mentioned in the previous video, the report would have content of each of the principle and what impacts, how are they managing the risk, and the risk and the environmental and social issues that they have in their operations. In conclusion, I would say that the Nigerian financial sector can better support environmentally and socially responsible economic in Nigeria by joining forces rather than standing alone. One of the principles aligns with this. Therefore, adopting all these principles will help drive a long-term sustainable growth while focusing on development priorities, safeguarding the environment and the people, as well as delivering measurable benefits to society and the real economy. We believe that adherence to this principle will provide benefits to our businesses, that's the banking businesses, the clients, the communities, and even the environment. And all banks should be prepared to take steps, and at Richflood, we are always willing to help. We conduct trainings, and we can help the banking sector and even the clients to achieve this sustainability report that is expected of them, to prepare we can help them in identifying the environmental and social risk and issues associated with their business operations, and we can help them to develop mitigation measures that will help them to manage, to minimize, and to offset all the identified impacts properly. Thank you very much.